Good day, everyone, and welcome to the IBM Security webinar. Today's session is focused on stopping advanced attacks at their onset, a practical look at modern-day prevention. Paul?
Great, thank you, Doris. And thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us for this webcast. So welcome if you're listening live or if you're listening to the replay of this webcast. I'm Paul Caspian. I'm a member of the IBM Security Systems division at IBM and work in the area of network security, specifically on our intrusion prevention platform. And wanted to spend some time today, talking about the idea of prevention. So, obviously the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion around the difficulty of blocking and preventing attacks. There's even some people in the security industry that have kind of claimed it's not possible anymore because it's gotten so difficult in terms of the complexity of the attacks and the complexity of the attackers. But I actually want to talk about some of the things that we're doing at IBM to help our clients get better at stopping some of these advanced attacks, and talk about the role of prevention within other security methodologies like detecting attacks after the fact or doing forensics or things like that, and also talk a little bit about some of the research that we do at IBM and share some interesting facts and figures around security over the last couple of years within the context of some of these attacks and prevention as well. So to kind of kick it off, we basically are very fortunate to have a great research team within IBM, our X-Force research team, that does a tremendous amount of vulnerability research, attack research. They look at a lot of the data generated by our managed security services, which gives them a lot of insight into what's happening across a very broad range of different clients and organizations that IBM works with. And I'll talk a little bit more later on the webcast about X-Force in general. But, essentially, when they actually looked at breaches over the last 12 years, they noticed a couple of different things. One is that there's just a lot more of them, obviously, and we know this by working in security. And there's a lot of high-profile ones that we've seen in the news. And attackers are using a lot of different methods to break into different organizations. And so several years ago, you might remember that web application attacks and vulnerabilities were really kind of the thing that we were hearing a lot about, and they actually continue to be very prevalent in terms of the attacks that we can see over the last several years, like SQL injection and things like that. But essentially, we're just seeing a lot more breaches, and we're seeing a lot more records compromised as a result of these different breaches. So the actual number of them, the severity of them, the different ways that attackers are using to break in, has really changed pretty dramatically. So if we kind of step back and we say, what's causing this increase in breaches, and what's causing sort of this, diversity, we'll say, in terms of different types of breaches, we can kind of, narrow it down to a couple of different categories. We know things like the number of vulnerabilities has increased pretty dramatically. So you basically have a larger attack surface. Another thing that's changed is that the attacks that are going after these vulnerabilities are really changing much more quickly than they were previous years. So attackers are basically changing up their methodologies to essentially usually evade signature-based technologies like signature-based IPS and things like that, and generally just to basically be able to exploit these vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis. We also see that currently attackers are a lot more coordinated, so they're working in coordinated teams. They're very focused. We talk a lot about the idea of advanced persistent threats and multifaceted threats, where we have teams of people that are actually conducting very, very sophisticated types of attacks that are basically coordinated together. So it's not just a single attack vector, but multiple attack vectors to try to get into a particular organization and steal sensitive data or things like that. And we're actually seeing these attackers really move very quickly, right? And so not only in the way they change their attacks, but how fast they incorporate attacks into exploit kits and things like that. And I'll actually share some really interesting information from the X-Force research report in regards to this kind of data point. So, a lot of the traditional security tools are not really helping us deal with some of these, and again, these are changing very quickly, and that's really why we're seeing this increase in breaches, and really the increased cost of a breach, which is kind of estimated at right around $6 million now, and that's from the Economist Institute to conduct their breach study. attackers moving more quickly and things like that. I wanted to offer a couple interesting data points from our X-Force research report. So we previously were publishing this report annually, and we actually moved to a quarterly format to kind of get out, get a lot of the data that we're seeing out more regularly. So I actually was looking through the Q3 report from last year and also the Q4 report. And if you haven't had a chance to download these, they're great resources. Q4 talks a lot about malware trends, where malware is hosted, command and control servers and things like that. Some great data points around kind of the nature of malware. Q3 actually focused a lot on the Heartbleed vulnerability as an example. And I just wanted to share this particular example to kind of show you this idea of how attackers are moving more quickly, right, and making prevention a lot harder to actually do effectively. So you can see here, April 7th, 2014, Heartbleed advisory was issued. But the very next day, we already had first proof of concept circulating. There had already been an attack against that vulnerability. And, so you can see how very quickly attackers are able to construct attacks against vulnerabilities and how hard that makes it for us, security professionals, to effectively, create a patch for the vulnerability, to, respond in a way to prevent that attack. And another great example of this would be if you go back to 2012, you take this particular Java advisory as well. Very similar type of a situation, where we had some details published about the vulnerability about a week later, and then less than a month later, about 2 weeks later, that exploit code was already in, the black hole exploit kit. So, now it's basically within an automated tool to conduct attacks against that vulnerability. So these are just a couple examples I wanted to share, and really nice data points from the quarterly reports that we put out that kind of illustrates this point of how much more organized and how much more motivated and how much more quickly the attackers are moving against security vulnerabilities in general. So, from a high level standpoint, at IBM, what we're trying to help our clients do is to move to a much more strategic approach to security. So you hear us talk a lot about security intelligence. We talk a lot about our QRadar platform that basically does very advanced security analytics, anomaly detection, things like that, to try to detect these multifaceted attacks. And what I really want to focus on today is actually more on the prevention side as opposed to the detection side, and talk about how we actually can stop a lot of exploits and attacks up front very early on in the attack chain, and really limit the amount of attacks that actually get through and that are detected later on in the cycle. So we basically, last May we introduced our new IBM threat protection system, and I mentioned a little bit about QRadar and the security intelligence platform. But essentially, this was a fully integrated approach to preventing attacks, to detecting existing attacks that are happening, right now, and also different types of anomalous activity, and also giving clients a way to respond. So in the case they do detect something that has penetrated the network and that is trying to exfiltrate data, they can quickly do forensics to figure out, the who, the what, what data was compromised, things like that. But today I'm going to focus more on the prevention side of things. What can we do up front, and how can we limit risk by stopping more of the attacks earlier on in the life cycle? And I'm going to focus mainly on the idea of intrusion prevention, stopping exploits, but also I'm going to get into a little bit about how we can actually stop initial malware infection, how we can block command and control traffic, things like that. So I'm going to focus on kind of two main IBM solutions. One is IBM Security Network Protection, XGS, and this is basically our NextGen intrusion prevention platform. We just introduced the 7100 appliance that does about 20 gigabits of throughput for some of our larger data center clients. And also going to talk about Trusteer Apex, which is basically endpoint malware protection, and talk a little bit about how it actually prevents malware installation versus just detection. So if you look at these two solutions together, the idea here is to basically, we've heard this term a lot of times, but break the attack chain, right? And really emphasis on not just breaking the attack chain, but trying to break it as early as possible, right? An example of that would be if we look at maybe a traditional approach to malware. We talk a lot about detecting existing installations of malware, right, or infections of malware. And that is certainly something also preventing the actual installation itself. And I'll talk a little bit about how Apex actually does that. But in essence, what we're trying to do is to essentially stop the installation on the actual endpoint. If we can't do that, we want to be able to stop the control channels to keep it from communicating out. And so between Apex on the endpoint and XGS on the network, we're really able to effectively to do that, to stop installation of malware, to stop exploits that are trying to plant malware, to stop this command and control traffic that comes from existing infections. And we can do that very effectively between these two different technologies. So a little bit about Apex first, and again, we're talking more about sort of the endpoint. Apex takes a very kind of multi-layered approach to dealing with advanced malware. And again, it's not just detecting existing installations of malware, but it's actually actively stopping the installation of malware up front, and very effective in preventing those types of infections. And it does that in a number of different ways that I'll kind of give you an overview of. Essentially, the main way it does that is through disrupting the exploit chain, and it basically can detect when it sees anomalous activity that is not expected behavior for the endpoint or the operating system. And it's very good at basically stopping that code from executing and actually planting the malware in the first place. But it can also do things like detect existing infections. It can do things like really lock down Java and keep malicious Java applications from executing as well. So there's different layers to the way that Trusteer Apex really works. But one of the most significant things that it can really do is to actually stop those initial infections. And so you can really see between the combination that I talked about of Apex and XGS that essentially you can block attacks that are trying to actively plant malware. If an attack gets through, Apex can stop the installation of malware, and you can quickly see how we can actually prevent a lot of these different types of attacks and infections throughout the attack chain between both on the endpoint and also on the network as well. Here's an example of how Apex is able to do it across multiple points in the attack chain. If you just look at sort of the malware example, right? So the delivery of the actual malware, looking at if it's actually installed and trying to exfiltrate data. Using these different types of layered technologies, Apex can stop malware at many different kind of points in the actual exploit chain. So a little bit, I want to move into sort of more details on the network side of things. We talked about prevention on the endpoint and preventing malware installations and detecting existing infections on endpoints. And we've actually had a lot of customers that use Trusteer Apex. Once they installed Apex, they actually found a lot of existing malware that they were unaware of. It wasn't getting caught by some of the signature-based technologies that they were using. And XGS is actually, I'll get into some more details on that, but XGS is actually very good at detecting those types of communications as well, not only for individual endpoints, but basically across the entire network. But the three things that XGS really does well, one is it has a very broad coverage of attacks. And I'll talk about how we kind of do that, but it's essentially looking at protecting or shielding different vulnerabilities against basically any type of attack that's trying to exploit them, versus using explicitly signatures, for instance, to just have a signature fingerprint of a particular attack. That makes it really good at doing things like zero-day protection, stopping exploits we haven't seen before or unknown attacks. And a lot of the sort of intelligence behind XGS is really powered by that X-Force research team that I was talking about earlier, who actively does this vulnerability research and feeds a lot of that intelligence directly into the XGS appliances and also some of our other solutions to make them more effective. And I'll actually talk a little bit about the X-Force team and what they do and some of the great data they actually have access to. So, XGS essentially is much different than a lot of intrusion prevention devices in the sense that most are, in fact, signature-based, solely signature-based. They have signatures that correspond to different types of attacks, whereas with XGS, we take, again, a vulnerability type of approach to this. So we take a particular vulnerability, we basically build protection into it that will detect if, any type of attack that is trying to exploit that vulnerability. And that's just a much different type of way of looking at it. And we've been doing doing that for quite a while with the intrusion prevention platform that we have, and really looking at protocols and things like that, as opposed to looking for matches to attack patterns, for instance. And so if you kind of look at that in terms of, traditional intrusion prevention, traditional intrusion prevention is very focused on, again, exploit signatures, right? So looking for pattern matching of specific attacks. So, if you look at, when a vulnerability is discovered, and then you start seeing different exploits that are coming out, again, we know that these attackers move extremely quickly in terms of developing those exploits. There's just, a significant amount of time that it takes to actually research that exploit, create an attack signature that matches it, and being able to stop those attacks. And so we use a variety of different technologies, from understanding the protocol and doing vulnerability decodes, using heuristics, using different types of behavioral technologies that are very capable of detecting attacks that we've never seen before. And they don't rely on that creation of a signature for each new attack as those attacks are discovered and as those attacks change over time. So you can see, if we go back to sort of some of the earlier points about how there's a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of times there are not patches available immediately. We know that attackers are moving much more quickly than they have in the past in terms of creating exploits and also automating those exploits. And so, intrusion prevention is still extremely relevant in its ability to be able to be a stopgap for those best practices of patching and vulnerability scanning, and effectively stop a lot of these attacks, even the ones that are new, and even the ones that we've never seen before. So if we look at, some examples of those, we had several over the years that when we looked at the actual vulnerability, and we looked at when we were actually capable of stopping it. Oftentimes, we were 6 months ahead of it, a year ahead of it, sometimes multiple years ahead of it. And even most recently, when we looked at shell shock, for instance, and looked at, vulnerabilities related to shell shock, across 10 different vulnerabilities, we actually had protection in the intrusion prevention appliances back in 2007 with a protection called shell command injection. And that actually was capable of blocking these modern attacks much earlier, obviously. So, this approach is much different. It's something we've been doing for quite a while, but even in the introduction of our next generation intrusion prevention appliances, it has the same kind of core technology, and we can see how, that's really beneficial in terms of even stopping modern vulnerabilities as well. And this is kind of the theme, in terms of IBM's philosophy to advanced threats, taking more of this behavioral approach as opposed to taking more of a static approach or a signature-based approach. So I talked a little bit about X-Force, and I want to give you a little bit more details on who X-Force is and what X-Force does. And essentially, we've had X-Force research for quite a while, and it's actually been an expanding team. X-Force originally came from the acquisition of ISS, the intrusion prevention portfolio for IBM, and has expanded from there. And the team, does a pretty wide range of work, from doing original vulnerability research. They've discovered a lot of different vulnerabilities and published quite a bit on different types of security topics over the years. I also mentioned earlier that they have access to a huge data set that's provided by our managed security services, and they can see a pretty broad swath of IP reputation, different attacks, rate of attacks, and things like that. And this is obviously really helpful in terms of helping us constantly improve on our capabilities in prevention and be able to stop attacks more effectively, things like that. So they're really a key part of our strategy going forward, and a key part of our prevention strategy. I mentioned some of the data points that X-Force has access to, and this is, if you look at, say, the managed security services, we have 3,700 plus clients that we actually manage security for worldwide. So X-Force can see different rates of attacks and see what's happening across several thousand clients. They see billions of different security events through the same method. And from a sort of research standpoint, they have over 8,000 documented this is essentially, I talked about exports expanding, with Trusteer, as we gained additional capabilities on the malware side, we did gain things like IP reputation from Trusteer, URL web category. We basically have access to data from over 100 million different endpoints, actually. And this is supplemental to URL database that exports have several billion URLs that catalog of vulnerabilities. And so we continue to expand out our research efforts and the data that we have access to, and use those to make our different prevention capabilities a lot more effective. So one example of this, just quickly, is essentially once we had access to that 100 million plus endpoints, we were able to really leverage the IP reputation data and make XGS able to actually block based on those data points and merge those data sources together. So one thing you're going to see from IBM going forward is that we're basically taking a lot of this wealth of data that we have and using it across different offerings and integrating those offerings together. So it isn't just about an IPS being able to detect an attack on its own. It's about the IPS getting smarter and using data from different data sources to make better blocking decisions and to be able to stop more sophisticated types of attacks. So I want to close out with pointing to a few resources where you can get some more information on what IBM is doing around threat prevention. So if you take a look at the website link there, you'll see a link to the IBM threat protection system, and that talks about the prevention capabilities that I talked about in this webcast today, both on the endpoint and the network. It talks about our QRadar security intelligence platform, and also how to respond, in the event of a breach, the tools that we provide to do that more effectively. I mentioned the Explorers intelligence reports. Again, we're publishing those every quarter now, as opposed to yearly. So you can go and download the latest reports from Q3 and from Q4 of last year, and get an idea of, some of the trends we're seeing from an IBM research standpoint as well. So I definitely encourage you to do that. And finally, I want to also encourage you to visit us on securityintelligence.com. That's our main site, where we have a lot of different blogs on security from people on our exports research team, from myself, and some of the folks in IBM security systems. And so that provides a lot of good information as well. So at this point, I want to actually turn it back to Doris, and we can open it for questions.